Let's talk about a book with one of the most provocative titles in 20th century philosophy, The Revolt of the Masses. I mean, it just sounds like a call to arms, right? A story of revolution. But what if the real revolt isn't happening out in the streets? What if it's happening inside our own heads?
So, where does this idea come from? We're diving into the work of a Spanish philosopher, José Ortega y Gasset. This all started way back in 1929, first as a series of newspaper articles. And in them, he was trying to diagnose what he saw as a really profound and honestly dangerous shift happening across European society.
And that diagnosis brings us right to the central mystery here. If this revolt isn't about people putting up barricades and waving banners, then what is it? What's actually doing the revolting?
Okay, so to really get what Ortega is saying, we have to kind of shift our whole perspective. He's not talking about a physical uprising. He's talking about a revolt of ideas, a revolt against a whole way of thinking.
You know, when you hear that phrase, the revolt of the masses, your brain probably jumps to a classic story, right? The working class, the poor, rising up against the rich and powerful. That's the narrative we all know. But Ortega's analysis completely flips that script on its head.
And here is the first big twist. For Ortega, this has absolutely nothing to do with social class. This is not a story about poor versus rich.
And this is where we clear up one of the biggest misunderstandings about this book. So, on one side, you've got the common idea, a classic class struggle. But on the other side, that's Ortega's actual point. He wasn't talking about a social group at all. He was describing a certain type of person, a psychological profile that he saw popping up in literally every single level of society.
So, if the revolt isn't about a social class, then who's the main character in this story? Well, Ortega gave this figure a pretty memorable name, the mass man. And the mass man isn't defined by his bank account or his job. He's defined completely by his mindset. This is a person who is just totally self-satisfied. They feel zero need to strive for anything better or greater. In fact, they actively resent anything and anyone that's excellent, individual, or just plain different.
And to make this idea really concrete, Ortega gave us a perfect example he called the Señorito Satisfecho, which basically means Mr. Satisfied. Picture this, a highly trained specialist who's an absolute genius in their one tiny field, but is proudly, almost contemptuously ignorant about everything else. This is the kind of person who thinks their expertise in one thing gives them the authority to have super strong opinions on, well, everything, without doing any of the actual work.
And this is where his diagnosis gets, honestly, a little chilling, because it's not just about being ignorant. It's about having a hostile attitude towards logic and reason itself.
Ortega just nails the psychology with this quote here. For the mass man, the highest possible value is just to be like everybody else. So anything that stands out, whether it's excellence, a unique skill, or just individuality, it's not just seen as different. It's seen as an indecent threat that has to be crushed.
And this right here, this gets to the absolute core of the revolt. It's the claim to a brand new right, the right to be wrong. See, the mass man doesn't want to debate you, he doesn't want to give reasons, he just wants to impose his opinions, celebrating what Ortega brilliantly called the reason of unreason.
And this is exactly why a book written way back in 1929 can feel so sharp, so almost eerily relevant today. For Ortega, this whole revolt against reason wasn't just some historical blip. The fundamental question he's asking is one we are still wrestling with.
For Ortega, the conclusion here was pretty bleak. He didn't see the rise of the mass man as some new, vibrant civilization taking over an old, tired one. No, he saw it as something way more dangerous. A simple, brute force negation of the very things that make civilization possible in the first place.
So that leaves us right here, almost 100 years later, still chewing on Ortega's big question. What happens to a society when the right to just assert your opinion becomes more important than the responsibility to actually be reasonable?